For Marvel Studios, Ant-Man took the long way around. It was in development as one of the earliest projects, but did not come out until it capped off Phase 2. This is due to a director shift. And we're going to talk about all of that, what could have been, what was, and where it ended up going from here, all this week in our Countdown to Doomsday on 30-Minute Reviews. Good morning and welcome to 30-Minute Reviews. I am Adam on the Countdown to Doomsday. We've reached the end of Phase 2. And when we talk about the MCU, again, we've talked about this quite a bit with Phase 2. The idea of, like, Marvel gets this string of hits, but really it starts now. Because when Avengers is okay. Avengers makes a lot of money because it is the first time we get this crossover. Then we get Iron Man 3, which is good, not great, it's good. Then we get Thor: The Dark World, which is not great at all. And then we get, Winter Soldier and Guardians back-to-back. And then because you get, back-to-back hits, you kind of forget about, Age of Ultron's not great. And then we go from there to Ant-Man. So we really cap off this thing with, these really great cinematic movies that are something kind of special. Because Ant-Man is a concept that is a tougher sell. It's about a guy who can shrink and later on grow really big, not in this movie, and it's entirely self-contained. There's a reference to Sokovia twice, where it's you get Hank saying the Avengers are probably too busy dropping a city out of the air, which is an important setup for Civil War. And then there's also when he's going through in the suit, he ends up in the he ends up on the newspaper, and the newspaper has an article about the Sokovia Accords, or the beginning foundations of what would become the Sokovia Accords. And we're starting to see that kind of build out, which is kind of required for where we end up with Infinity War and Endgame. And I think we're going to end up talking about, again this week, this idea of this appears a lot more laid out than anything that happened in the later films, in the post, the post Endgame MCU, the multiverse saga. And what I mean by that is, when we look at what this is doing, so many elements of this end up being fleshed out so much deeper than it really needed to be coming out of an Ant-Man movie. The idea of the quantum realm and all of that is introduced here, where it's hey, you go down there, time works differently. That's where Janet ended up, and she vanished and she's been living down there. But it's kind of a big thing, and it ends up being the salvation of, the world to fix what happened in Infinity Wars through the time travel that is kind of seeded here. We also have the, what was the other really big thing that gets introduced here? Laying the groundwork for Civil War and kind of passively, not intently, laying the groundwork for what would come later on. Because that's the big thing about, Civil War, is that it is this moment where it is hey, the public has started to turn on the Avengers, and it's how much of that is public knowledge, how much of what happened is a problem. And really that's the entirety of what Age of Ultron brings. Without Age of Ultron, you can't get to where we are in Infinity War, because you need the team broken up. You need to have everyone, disparately scattered, because if the Avengers are all together and the team is all there, when Thanos shows up on Earth, it's not a conflict. But because Tony and Peter end up in space and all these things have to, everyone has to happen separately, the only way Thanos wins is because the team is separated. And you need that build here, where it's look, what happened there was a big deal, but you have the Hulk going fucking nuts in where was that? That was in Africa where he goes ape shit, and they gotta stop him. Like that whole thing is kind of an important aspect of this, where it's like, the world's gonna start to turn on the Avengers, so you need to start seeding that in here. The other thing this movie kind of starts laying out is another thing that never came to pass, in the form of, and that's the thing, is that it's like, yeah, the initial seeding of things that came to pass by the time Endgame happened is important, and then we also see Ant-Man later on become the genesis point for, what was going to be the Kang Dynasty. The issue with that is, the other thing it really lays out the groundwork for is Armor Wars. Between this and Ant-Man and the Wasp, we'll get to as we get closer to Doomsday, we'll get there. But like the idea that we have this, this whole conflict happening, and at the center of it is, weapons manufacturers trying to get a hold of their version of Stark Tech. It's a very important thing to lay the groundwork for when we've been kind of seeing this seeded throughout the MCU as a whole. So the idea that Pym is going to, not Hank Pym himself, but Pym Tech, or what was it, was it Pym Tech? I think it was Pym Tech. But the idea that Pym Tech is going to go out there and try to build out this, this alternate suit that's like, Iron Man's, but he can shrink as well. It's an important thing to flesh out, especially if they were going to do Armor Wars as a TV show, and then that got scrapped, and then they decided they're going to do Armor Wars as a movie, which we haven't heard any movement on. Now, could that mean we're looking at Armor Wars as part of the 2028 slate? Who knows? Because 2028, I think, confirmed is an X-Men movie, confirmed is a Black Panther movie, but I believe there are 3 slots, and there are 2 movies that we know are in development between Blade, and they also announced this, the Armor Wars movie. And it'd be interesting to see what takes. Like, I think Black Panther gets the February slot. Black Panther, the original, did very well in the February slot, but it also did very well in the November slot. I think they're going to want to keep the November slot for Blade. That's probably a smart move. Atmospheric, let's see how that goes. But I'm very curious as to, if we get the Armor Wars movie, excuse me, and if the Armor Wars movie pulls from that, plus there's also Shang-Chi too. There's a lot. Doctor Strange 2, or 3. There's a lot of options they can go with. So like that's kind of the big thing here, is that it's like the reason why this movie works is because first and foremost it's a character study. It's about Scott Lang, who is this guy who just wants to do the right thing, did what he thought was right illegally, ended up in jail for it, and then is trying to get his life back on track. And the opportunity comes along for him to do the right thing, and he wants to do that, to do right by his kid. And that's, Paul Rudd plays that character so well that it entirely works. Because you're like, oh, I buy him as this character. I buy him as this, criminal with a heart of gold. And I love him there. The supporting cast in this movie works really well. And then also fleshing out the MCU in a way that is substantially larger than initially laid out, where it's like, what was S.H.I.E.L.D. doing, and the idea that, like, oh, there was an Ant-Man who was operating as a, who was operating as an agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. back in the 80s and the 90s. It's a interesting wrinkle to add to this, where it's like, oh, this isn't the beginning of the superpowered individuals. It's not the Avengers. These things go deeper, and then we would eventually see with Captain Marvel. It goes into the 90s. And then also, like, I think What If actually does it really interesting. One of my favorite What If episodes is what if the Avengers assembled in the 90s? And it's like the Winter Soldier and Goliath and the Red Guardian. And it's a really interesting concept to have them have to take on, teenage Peter Quill having awakened his powers. But that's the thing, is that it's like the fact that they grounded this in this human interest story, and it comes back to, I think we've said it on here, what was Stan Lee's mantra when it came to developing these superhero characters. We call them superhumans. We're going to emphasize the human. Why do we care about Peter Parker? It's because Peter Parker as a person is important. It's not just who he is when he puts on the suit, and that's something that's always kind of stuck with me as his, and I think I editorialized the last part about Spider-Man, but like his thing was emphasize the human and the superhuman, tell the human story, and that's why this movie works. And that's why the MCU movies that do work and work the best are the ones that emphasize that human part. Iron Man is the story of a guy who has to reckon with what his legacy will be. Captain America is about this guy who is steadfastly in, trying to do the right thing and stand up for the little guy. Ant-Man is a movie about a guy who's trying to do right by his daughter and trying to be the best version of himself and make the world better for his kid. And I think that that's why this movie works as well as it does. When we start getting away from that and we start making these movies about something bigger, that's where it starts to fall apart. And that's kind of why the difference between this and Quantumania. Quantumania has a really interesting thing that they can play with, and they kind of touch on it a little bit, and we'll get way more into this when we get into Phase 5, but Quantumania introduces the fact, or reintroduces the fact, that when the blip happened, Cassie survived. Cassie was still alive. 5 years happened and Scott reappears. He missed 5 years of his life. Now, those are formative years for Cassie because didn't have Scott there as this moral compass. And what does that do to her in these developmental years? And how does this character who is estranged from that reconnect with his daughter? It's a really interesting conundrum they put it in. And I think that casting Catherine Newton in that role was a really interesting idea because Catherine Newton, we know, has the range to be able to do that. We've seen her in A Map of Tiny Perfect Things. She's great and freaky. She was just in Ready or Not 2, Here I Come. She's a great actress, and I think that that's something that would have given her the space to really, develop into something more and develop that into something else. But the fact that it gets so bogged down in the Kang of it all and the MODOK of it all is kind of where the movie falls apart a little bit, and that's kind of the disappointing thing. But all of that said, the issue that I come out of Ant-Man with, I would say Ant-Man is a 5 out of 5. It is one of it's not my favorite, and I think the issue with Phase 2 is that if we're ranking the Phase 2 movies, number one, I think is number one would be The Winter Soldier. I think The Winter Soldier will always be my favorite Phase 2 movie. Second is going to be Guardians. 3 is going to be Ant-Man. 4 is going to be Iron Man 3. 5 is going to be Age of Ultron. 6 is going to be Thor: The Dark World. That's kind of a definitive, and a fair ranking. You might be able to sway me to like Guardians of the Galaxy more than, The Winter Soldier. I feel confident that if we ever do revisit a ranking like this, I probably won't deviate from that. But I think that the end result that we're looking at here is we just have more hits than misses, but the misses are more strategically placed where they're kind of noticeable. And I think that was kind of the thing, where when you have 4 really good movies, or 3 really good movies and a good movie, and then 2, not as good movies, one of which needs to be redeemed by a later movie, the idea that, I can see how we get to this point, but I could also see a world in which, if it happened right now, coming off of the Avengers going into Iron Man 2. Iron Man 2 right now, it was a culture war back in 2013. Iron Man 2 right now, if that movie came out, would be an insufferable culture war. Between Pepper saving the day, between the Mandarin reveal, all of that would not fly right now. People would be pissed off, and Elon Musk will be talking about how it's the death of Western civilization, and it's a whole thing. But that's kind of the thing where it's like, if that happened, and then we went right into Thor: The Dark World, it's like, would we get the same panicked response that we kind of got now in the middle of the multiverse saga? And I think the answer is kind of yes. And it's just my hope is that because they're giving the mutants, and we haven't gotten confirmation yet, but we've called it the mutant saga on here. That's almost certainly what the next phase of this is going to be when we get into phase 7 in 2028. Almost certainly we're going to be looking at the arrival of the X-Men in the MCU proper. I think it's basically confirmed now that Sadie Sink is playing Jean Grey in Brand New Day. That's going to be the first character. There are inklings that we're going to get a announcement of the full X-Men cast at Comic-Con this year in Hall H. I think that would be probably premature. I would think you'd probably want to do that next year. As kind of like a looking ahead for the post-Secret Wars MCU, unless these characters are going to appear in Secret Wars. And again, I did hear that Sadie Sink is going to be appearing in Secret Wars a few months ago, or last year. I'm fairly certain that was confirmed, or not confirmed, but it was the streets are saying that Sadie Sink's going to appear, and that's kind of the situation that we find ourselves in, is that it's like, hopefully they're letting this bake, and it's like, look, I don't think we're gonna get to, like, Magneto's a good end of phase 1 villain, and then, like, do we get, do they go Bastion like they did in X-Men 97? Do they build towards Apocalypse as this kind of background villain? Like, that'd be a really cool thing to have happen. Like, one of the things that, like, we kind of have to think about, and this is postulating based on what we know, where it's like, there's a theory out there that the reason why the X-Men have not appeared in the MCU, the in-universe reason, not the legal issues reason, is that the mutants in the Fantastic Four did not exist because He Who Remains, at the end of the timeline, the variant of Kang from the MCU 19999999, or 616, depending on what we're acknowledging, the MCU doesn't have those characters because they were culled from the timeline by He Who Remains. Because He Who Remains' entire thing was, we have to stop incursions and prevent them from happening. If we can keep ourselves isolated from, the rest of the multiverse, then they won't come here, they won't fuck with us. And the characters who would be dealing with that, Professor X and, all these characters who are smart enough to do that, are all culled, and they don't exist in the MCU in its current form. Now, why are we having the beginning of some of them arriving? Well, now He Who Remains is dead, so here comes Jean Grey, and that's fine. The other thing that this theory, talks about is the idea that, like, Tony Stark was allowed to develop time travel with Hank Pym because Tony died shortly after. And they were like, look, we can't do this anymore, so let's just, let's not fuck with this. And they don't use it as a thing to solve problems anymore. So they just kind of let that happen because, again, that was the best thing for the sake of the timeline in general. So the idea that, like, that makes sense to me. So then in the new world, then you get, He Who Remains is gone, the TVA is gone, Loki, the god of stories, I would assume is going to be killed, and what you end up with is the new MCU, which will have the mutants and the Fantastic Four integrated in properly. And then we'll get a cohesive Marvel universe that is there. The idea is that it's like the quote-unquote true MCU never really existed. This one is a facsimile created to prevent incursions, then the incursion happens anyway, and then once everything's fixed, it's all back to normal. Now, it's a really interesting theory, but I think the thing that I really think is interesting about this is, if this is the case, and this is where we're going to go with this, what could be done from here is we could have the arrival of a character like Apocalypse as a good overarching bad guy. Because he is someone who spans the timeline, and now that the TVA is gone and He Who Remains is gone, and all these entities that prevent that from happening are gone, it's a really interesting potential dynamic to introduce this character who could potentially have, propped up all over time, and now the Avengers have to fight him, and it allows them to do and recycle what they may have been planning to do for the Kang Dynasty, but with Apocalypse. And I think that's a really interesting possible idea that I'm postulating. I have no insider information. I'm just saying that'd be a cool idea. I'd be all for that. And then, of course, Fox has been, slowly edging using the idea of Mr. Sinister. So who knows? But like I said, Ant-Man is, great. It's worth revisiting. It's fun. The entire supporting cast in this movie is just phenomenal. I love the entirety of his friends, and the training sequence is just great, where it's like the voice of reason from Hank trying to explain to Scott how to use the powers and use the suit and all of that is really good. And I so much about this movie is just so good. But we'll wrap up there for today. Next week we start Phase 3 with Captain America Civil War. Now, the other thing that's worth addressing is that we will eventually do another episode of this off schedule when we get the Doomsday trailer. We still have not gotten that yet. It is kind of a little bit weird. We got a Dune Messiah trailer, which is opening the same day, but we have not gotten the Doomsday trailer, and I'm not entirely sure why that is. We also haven't gotten a second Spider-Man trailer, although one did leak. So it's entirely possible that I'm talking about this, because I'm recording this Sunday night. It is entirely possible that I'm talking about this now, and I'm going to look like an asshole because the Spider-Man trailer drops Monday or Tuesday. And that would be, and then, by the time we talk about this, or this episode goes live, we will have been like, oh, well, that trailer's out already, so who knows. But I do think that, the latest we're getting a Doomsday trailer is, I think the absolute latest we get it is the last week of July. And I know I've said this several times already, and I've been wrong several times already on this, but I think the most likely date is that they're going to attach it to Moana. If they don't put it out this week to put before Toy Story. Because, that's an option. They could put it out next week to put it before Supergirl. But I think you gotta, I'm very surprised they didn't put it out before The Mandalorian and Grogu. Try and prop up those numbers. But we'll wrap up there for today, and until our next episode, have a great rest of your week.
Before you go, I also write fiction. My newest novel, Succession Planning, is out on August 28th, available both in paperback and an ebook. It follows a journalism grad stuck managing a store while the owners wage a quiet war over who takes over the business. It's about ambition, inertia, and taking the easiest choice. The link is in the description. That's Succession Planning, out on August 28th.